Hello, this is the 7th talk, part 2, in the series of lectures on the central nervous system, the periphery nervous system and the waters they live in. I'm recording in nature, so you may hear different noises around, and there are anatomy paintings to go with this talk, so it's good to look at those on my website where there's a far better representation of them. And in this talk we will be continuing to look at the myelinated glial cells, but we're also going to look at the whole story of how these lectures came about and how I'm viewing these myelinated glial cells in this particular way. So, my initial training and view of the central nervous system and cranial fluid within it was from 2 craniosacral trainings, practitioner trainings that I did in the early 90s and mid-90s. And in these trainings we were taught the conventional view of the craniosacral fluid, that it's around the central nervous system, around the spinal cord, and within the ventricles, and the ventricle running down the center of the spinal cord, but the whole body of the central nervous system, the cerebrum, the brainstem, the cerebellum, the spinal cord, the body of this weren't talked of, and the fluid within it wasn't talked of. It wasn't part of it. It was just the cranial fluid around the spinal cord and the cranial fluid within the ventricles. That may have changed by now, and I'm sure it has to one level or another. And so here we have that. So it was the initial training I had, that the cranial fluid was around here, down here, and within the ventricles, down the centre of the spine. Then the whole body of this wasn't really included. We worked with it, but not as cranial fluid. And then around this whole system is a membrane called the dura. And within the conventional way of looking at this, the dura is impervious. The cranial fluid can't travel through it. And I'm calling it cranial fluid rather than water, because that is how it's normally taught, as cranial fluid. The cranial fluid couldn't flow through the dura and also couldn't flow out through the nerve. So it was completely contained within this system. Nothing moved out, nothing moved in. It was a kind of isolated system. And that was it. And there was all the energies of it and how the energies travelled through the body, but that all stayed within that system. And as I say, I think it's progressed since then, and is now working with the whole thing as cranial fluid, but I'm really unsure. And at that time, even though it was taught that the cranial fluid doesn't travel down through the nerves. A lot of the tutors were saying that themselves, and quite a lot of people palpate it. They feel when you put your hands on people's bodies and you feel what's happening, they felt it as travelling out through the nerves, but couldn't see how that would happen in the anatomy. So that was my initial training. I'm sure that has all changed quite a lot by now. But anyway, I had that, and I was happy with that, and I was working, doing healing with that. And come about 2002, 2003, when I discovered the holographic breathing and started breathing with the holographic breathing, I no longer perceived this whole system as I had been trained. I perceived it all as cranial fluid around the central nervous system, within the ventricles of the central nervous system, within the membranes, cells, around the cells, the central nervous system. I felt it as all fluid, and I felt it as flowing off and out through the body, and mainly out through the nerves. And this felt wonderful. At the time I was pretty well dying of Lyme's disease. I was really very ill with Lyme's disease, and I'd had it for about 7 years, and Lyme's disease attacks the central nervous system, and it produces a lot of neurotoxins which make you very tired indeed, very, very fatigued. Along with everything else, there's this really strong fatigue. And with the holographic breathing, as this all started to breathe and I could feel the fluid throughout flowing off, I could also feel it was eliminating the waters, the cranial fluid coming out was eliminating these toxins, and it was flowing off and it was flowing out through the nerves, and then the body was dealing with these toxins and taking them out and away. So suddenly my whole central nervous system, in my image of it and my breath with it, had this elimination which I didn't perceive before. My image wasn't the same, but as soon as I started doing holographic breathing, I could no longer hold that image because I could feel it. I could feel the energies. I could feel the fluids throughout, and I could feel it flowing off and out through the body, and I could feel the toxins leaving. As soon as I had this new image and feeling of it travelling out through the nerves, it just felt like this whole system could breathe. Because it was no longer confined within this membrane with no connection to the rest of the body. It was isolated within itself in my original image of it. But as soon as it was travelling out through the nerves and flowing into the rest of the body, there was this breath. It could breathe, it could let go, and it felt like it could produce more fluid because there was avenues for it to flow through, so it could produce more. And I could feel these toxins releasing and releasing and releasing and travelling out through the nerves, and my whole health really took a turn for the better at that point, as there was this whole eliminative thing came into process, and that my central nervous system could breathe. It could eliminate, and then after a while, as it eliminated and eliminated, then the light started coming through it and also shining out through the nerves. They became a bit like optic fibres, or as we now know them, optic tubes, flowing off through the body, and very, very fluid quality to it. It had the same quality as the fluids within the central nervous system. So that was my experience, which was different to how it's held conventionally. So I just held it as my experience, and that became my reality, and it was so health-giving for me. I didn't really mind how it is conventionally held. I just stayed with that, these rivers of light, my whole central nervous system offloading, letting go. It felt truly beautiful. And in Seminar 4 we teach the central nervous system, and as none of my students were craniosacral therapists or doctors or different people who had this image of it, a more conventional image, I just taught it as it was. But come making the download version of Seminar 4, I thought, well, I have to explain myself, and also to look into the anatomy to see, why I feel it like that, and within this conventional view, it's not. And as I looked into the anatomy more and more, it just seemed to show how I was experiencing it was actually correct. Within the traditional anatomy, what I was seeing and feeling was actually correct, but for somehow the image that was held within this traditional way of looking at it was different to how the anatomy was. So I was surprised to find that the cranial fluid, or what I call waters, because I don't want to distinguish between the two, the cranial fluid within the central nervous system and the cranial fluid within the ventricles around, was actually the same fluid. And it was 99% water, and as soon as I knew it was water I was talking about, I could understand what was happening, because I understood the qualities of water. I understood how light travels through water, how the breath moves through water, how the different energies travel through water, how it's a medium, how it's got a memory. It made sense that the light and energies were travelling through the water, and that they were both 99% water, and that is what the light was using. And as soon as I knew it was water, then I thought, well, you can't stop it moving off down through the nerves, because water will travel through any membrane, any gate, any cell, anywhere in the body via osmosis. It will just go there. So it can move down the nerves, it can move out through the dural membrane. And then looking into it further, I found, well, the arterial blood brings more water than the venous blood can take back. So there's this surplus water, and if it's not going back through the venous blood, where else can it go back? It can't go inwardly, it has to travel out, and the only way out is either through the dural membrane or down through the nerves. And the more I looked into it, the more it was showing my image to be true. And then as I looked into the anatomy of the nerves, there was nothing to stop the waters flowing down the nerves. Here we have a nerve, as shown before. Got the body of the nucleus, the body of the neuron, the axon, then it breaks up and joins to another neuron, and it has these myelinated glial cells around it. The nerves are long ones of these. It has the body of the nucleus. If we're looking at the nerves coming out of the spine, it has the body and nucleus of the neuron within the spinal cord, and then out comes the axon with the myelinated glial cells around it, and that travels. It can be up to 1 meter long, travelling down the legs to a toe or through the arms to a finger. They can be 1 meter long. They're long neurons with myelinated glial cells around them. And here we have them coming out down through a nerve. This is the ventricle down the center of the spinal cord. This is the body of the spinal cord. This is the cranial fluid, or the water around the spinal cord. And then here we have the neurons, the myelinated glial cells, the axons, travelling out as a bundle, which make nerves, and they're synapsing with other neurons for the central nervous system. In drawing these pictures and looking at these pictures, I could not see how could the water not flow down there. It can come from the ventricle down the centre of the spine into the spinal cord and down. It can come from the capillaries in the spinal cord and down. It can come from the cranial fluid, or the waters around the spinal cord, either straight into the nerve. These comes out as very fine branches and build into bigger ones. So this is fine. This is that cell wall here. It gets thicker as it comes out and becomes a nerve. It can also, the cranial fluid or water around can flow into, this is very fine, the pia mater just flows in and out through that, can flow in and down through the nerve. So for me, I could not understand where this image had come from. And the question wasn't, could the waters of the central nervous system flow down through the nerves? The question wasn't that. It was obvious to me it does, and I had always felt it as it does. But how would it keep its integrity as cranial fluid? Because when I felt it flowing off down through the nerves, I could feel that same quality of water in the nerves as I felt within the body and around the body of the central nervous system. I felt this quality of water that was 99% water. It had that very same quality. So it wasn't how did it flow down the nerves, it was how did it keep its integrity as 99% water as it flows down through the nerves. Because later there's a blood supply that comes to the connective tissue between these nerve tubes. And the connective tissue is very fine, soft fibres, also fluids, water can flow through that, but there's a blood supply to it later which doesn't have tight connections. So it's the same as the body. It will have proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids, different pathogens will be there, viruses will be there. And how would the water not mix with that and then become 80% water or 85% water? How would it keep its integrity as 99% water? This was my question, because that was how I experienced it. It was the same quality of fluid in the nerves as I felt within the body of the central nervous system. And here we have them travelling off, down, through the nerves, each one. And I call these, now I'm showing you this picture, I can explain why. These are normally called nerve fibres. But there's nothing fibrous about it. This is a tube full of intercellular fluid. Then we've got water flowing between the folds of these myelinated glial cells. And then within the myelinated glial cells we've got intercellular fluid. So it's very fluid. And for me these become rivers. And within the central nervous system there's gaps between these, small gaps called nodes. But within the periphery nervous system they press up against each other. So I could see how the fluid would flow through and then down and then into the next one and would make capillaries. And I also saw them working by capillary action and actually wicking the fluid along them. They would pull this river of water along them. So I call them nerve capillaries because that is accurate to the amount of fluid in them and what I see them as doing. But I could not, I was looking for ways that this would somehow keep the integrity of 99% water, and I started looking at these gaps, maybe these gaps where the water was so fine that it couldn't let in the larger particles, but that wasn't so. And I did a lot of research. This has gone on for quite a while. It really has, a lot of research. And then one day I was looking at kind of a university type thing on the myelinated glial cells, and if I can find the link I will connect to it, because the pictures of the glial cells in it are very similar to how I've painted them. And it showed the connection between these folds of the glial cells and how they connect to the axon. And they were the same, they were these fine connectors, the same type of connectors as on the endothelial cells that make these 400-mile long filter for the central nervous system. They were the same type of connectors as within the coryplexus of the ventricles, of producing this 99% water for the ventricular system. Tight connectors making this very fine junction that only pure water can come through. So then I knew, because all of the exits and all of the entries have these fine connections that only water, inside they are creating their own environment, that it is pure water inside there plus whatever intelligence the cell has, whatever it wants to bring in. And it will almost certainly be sodium, because the axon needs sodium for the electrical charge to travel through it, oxygen for this, oxygen for the inside of the glial cells, nutriments, glucose. So for me, it hasn't been investigated, nobody knows, nobody's looked at the waters within it. They've been interested in the membranes, not the waters. I'm interested in the water. So nobody really knows what's in there, and they're so fine they can only just see them with an electromagnoscope, let alone find out what's in the water inside. But one day they will find this out. We will know one way or the other. But for me, as soon as I found out these were a filter, and each single, and there are trillions of these, there's 100 billion neurons, and some of these are a meter long, so they're going to be trillions and trillions of these myelinated glial cells, and each one is a filter creating its own environment of 99% water. These glial cells bring the environment of the central nervous system with them. They create the same environment. This was a real Eureka moment for me when I realised this. It's how there's nerves can have their own supply of 99% water environment. Because I could not see it before. And it just flows down from one to the other, each one a filter, and then as it comes into the other, it will let through the nutriments it wants, it will let through the oxygen it wants, it will let through the sodium it wants. So there's this river, thousands and thousands of little separate rivers. I call them nerve capillaries. And these have quite a bright quality, as I said, as I perceived it coming out from the central nervous system and going down the nerves. I couldn't hold it as they were described in the books, because they're just talking about the more physical side of these myelinated glial cells. I tried feeling that, and that wasn't what I was feeling. I was feeling these rivers of fluid, and I can feel the different qualities of the different parts of the body. And what I was feeling with this is that the water had that quality. It had the same quality within the cerebrum, of the ventricles, around the ventricles. But there was a brightness to it. There's a real brightness. These become like optic fluid tubes. So that's what I was feeling, and we will carry on and look at how this relates to what we're viewing now in the central nervous system, all these fluid tracks of neurons and myelinated glial cells, how they're running. So now we can expand into that further, that you know where that is originating from, and compare the different things. Okay, this lecture is now coming up to its half hour before it stops, so just breathing. And if you can feel that, these are very bright. Well, they may start off dark, but as they clear, they just become brighter and brighter and brighter. Lovely bright energy travelling down through the nervous system, out through the nerves, through the whole central nervous system, the cranial nerves, the periphery nerves. Okay, thank you. You will now look at that, continue to look at that in the central nervous system.